I'm Paul Robertson, City Curator with the City of Kingston and Vice President with the OMA, and I am really happy to welcome you to our final panel for this year's OMA Annual Conference entitled, Can Museums Be Brave? And we have to my left an esteemed panel of people who are going to share some wonderful ideas with us all. And closest to me is our first panelist, an ancient history scholar and classical archaeologist by training. Henry Kim joined the Aga Khan Museum from the University of Oxford, where he taught, curated collections, and managed capital projects at the Ashmolean Museum from 1994 to 2012. From 2004 to 2011, he was the project director for the Ashmolean Redevelopment Project, a £70 million redevelopment and transformation of the museum. He then became director of the University Engagement Program, a 3-year project sponsored by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, aimed at expanding the use of the museum's collections in teaching across the university. And on the far side, we have Ross Laird, PhD, who is an author, clinical consultant, educator, and scholar. His work focuses on the interconnected themes of mentorship, trauma, addictions, mental health, and creativity. Ross has worked with hundreds of organizations and thousands of individual clients and students from Vancouver's downtown east side to corporate boardrooms and university classrooms across North America. Ross is interested in the spaces between things, in the unspoken, in the unexamined and unexpressed. In his consulting work, he focuses on difficult and complex themes such as educational innovation, mental health, addictions, trauma, childhood development, conflict resolution, creativity, leadership, and technology. He has worked with large corporate clients, governmental organizations, post-secondary educational institutions, professional organizations, independent schools, nonprofit organizations, such as the National September the 11th Memorial and Museum, and many other groups. And our panel moderator today, my colleague on OMA Council, Cheryl Blackman, who's the Director, Museums and Heritage Services at the City of Toronto. Formerly Assistant Vice President, Audience Development at the ROM, and an OMA Council member. Her responsibilities included ensuring a quality experience for the front of house and diversity and inclusion for the museum. Cheryl was the main point of contact for more than 1,300 volunteers, and she led the ROM's community access network known as ROMCAN, which she created and has grown into more than 60 partnerships with organizations across the GTHA. Cheryl's leadership and commitment to inclusion has grown this area into a highly successful part of the ROM, where the museum regularly achieves high satisfaction levels amongst visitors and wins awards for innovation in all aspects of access and community building. Cheryl holds a Bachelor of Social Work and a Master of Business Administration, and is a Fellow of Inclusion and Philanthropy from the Association of Fundraising Professionals. She is the incoming Vice Chair at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery and an Officer of the Diversity Committee at the American Alliance of Museums. Please join me in welcoming Henry Kim, Ross Laird, and Cheryl Blackman.
Thank you very much, Paul, and good afternoon to everyone. It's so exciting to see this group here on a Friday afternoon, so thank you. A big round of applause for everyone being here till the end of the day. I am extremely thrilled to be sitting in the middle of these two gentlemen, and we're going to be having a conversation. You can see that we're not using podium, except for the very kind of brief introduction at the beginning. We really wanted to have a dialogue, and we want to also engage this audience as part of that dialogue, so we will be turning to you as well. Just a little bit about then what we're going to be focusing on. So over the last 2 days, we have had so many amazing conversations about collaborating for impact. And we've seen so many examples of why, it is not business as usual. So over the next 45 minutes, we will explore this question, and these two gentlemen and myself will have a conversation, and we will hopefully really interrogate the subject in a way that maybe is not expected and will provoke some new ideas and thinking in our sector. So I wanted to start by asking Henry Kim to maybe give us some background, and I think you're going to use the podium for that? You're going to do it from here? Awesome. So we're actually not using the podium at all. So over to you, Henry.
Thank you very much. I thought I'd give you a very quick overview of the Aga Khan Museum and what we've been doing. I'm not certain how many of you have been there yet. Can I get a raise of hands? That's not everyone yet. By the way, with your OMA pass, you get going free all weekend. So get up there to the museum or down there. It's only about 2 or 3 miles down the road from here. Now, I think a lot of you probably have heard about the museum. Many of you haven't been there yet, but we've been open for 4 years right now. And as a museum, we are a museum that is a bit unusual because we're a combination of the visual arts, exhibition galleries, collection galleries, but we're also about performing arts. We're about the living arts, about food, music, and dance. And I think that one of the interesting things is that when you look at what museums are today, it is not business as usual. I started my career in the oldest museum in the world, the Ashmolean, which was very much business as usual. But even old creatures, such as the Ashmolean, had to reinvent themselves in the last decade or so. And I think museums throughout the world, not just in Ontario, are having to reinvent themselves because it's no longer acceptable. Let's put it this way. The audience is not just expecting to have visual displays and top-down information created by curators because they feel this is what they should put forward. Museums have to push outwards. They have to look at audience engagement and the communities with whom they serve. And it's becoming much more of a bottom-up approach to understand what museums' functions truly are within their context, their communities, within their organizations. And certainly with a museum like the Aga Khan Museum, we've had to do this from scratch because we've had no history whatsoever. It's nice to go from a museum with a heck of a lot of history, but also one that's had none whatsoever, because the challenges are actually exactly the same. What is your community actually looking for? And I think that when you look at a museum like the Aga Khan Museum, our museum stands for understanding about the Muslim world. It was founded by His Highness 4 years ago to improve people's understanding and appreciation of the arts and culture of the Muslim world, and by doing so to learn more about who Muslims are and what is Islam. And again, it begs a lot of questions. Which communities is it there to serve? How do you dig into the Muslim community as one target audience, but then also the non-Muslim communities beyond? And part of the approach that we've developed is we have to do this in a multisensory way. Don't just rely upon objects. Look at the living arts, look at food, look at cuisine, look at the whole cultural experience, rather than simply the historic collection on which the museum was actually founded. And I think this is a very important point because as you look at museums today, they are now becoming very ideas-driven. In the past, exceptionally collections-driven. Today, it's all about the ideas that they can actually put forward. A museum like the Louvre, when it came up with its satellite in Lens, completely transformed the way they looked at cultures by looking at it across cultures and across time. One single gallery space in which 10,000 years of human history was actually laid out geographically and chronologically in a way that you could actually meander from one culture to the other. It was actually the same approach we took at the Ashmolean Museum, but they had a better space to do this in. I like the warehouse. We had lots of little galleries, but both museums approached looking at world culture in a completely different manner than previously. Again, the ideas are driving it. How do you connect cultures together? You look at a new museum, relatively new, Orhan Pamuk's Museum of Innocence in Istanbul, where again, it's about an idea. It's not about a single collection. It's about the idea that he wants to look at personal histories. And again, these are wonderful ideas to look at as museums interacting with publics in their communities. British Museum and their development of the Hajj exhibition, again, this was very much focused on not let's document the Hajj with objects and this and that. Let's create the experience. Let's try to get people who've been on the Hajj to relate to what's shown. But also let's show people who've never been on the Hajj and will never go on the Hajj to understand what's involved in it. The video was probably stronger than any of the objects there. And again, museums are getting into this idea of how do you get the ideas, the feeling, the emotions, the experience across. And I think that's a very key part of looking at how museums have to be brave today. It's no longer business as usual. You have to take some chances. You have to reach outwards and try to find those points of contact with individuals and communities, which may not be standard. They may be a bit challenging. They may challenge the ways that you work, and I think there's a lot of that in how museums have to be brave. You have to challenge your own ways of working. And if you do so, I do believe the rewards will be there, because when you look at all of those things, all of those examples here, they are top displays and top exhibitions of recent memory. And this is something that I think, whether you're a big museum or a very small museum, the same issues apply. How do you actually get the most out of the ideas that, and the communities in which you work? Museums and displays, I think, have to become more meaningful, more emotive. And I'm just going to close by showing you a video which was about an exhibition that we hosted at the museum about 2 years ago called Syria Living History. And again, our intent there was, well, I'll let the video explain itself, but it was not business as usual. We created an exhibition in under 12 months, and I think all of you know how long it takes to create an exhibition. It's not 12 months. But we did it because we felt the need. We needed to look at the Syrian experience, to give people a sense of who Syrians are, and to let Syrians actually experience it. And these are Syrians who were newcomers to this country. And so I'll close on this, and it's about 3.5 minutes, but I think it'll give you a sense of the emotions that museum displays can actually evoke if they're done in a very meaningful sort of way. And in fact, before I show the video, I think it's very important that when you look at bravery and how you have to push out the boundaries, you have to do it sensitively. You cannot just be brave for the sake of being brave. That doesn't work. You have to do it because you have a good reason. It fits within the mission of your museum. And you also are doing it in a measured way and understanding and being circumspect about what the consequences are. Because the one thing I always tell people is be careful for what you wish, because you may get it, but you may also get a lot of collateral. And that's where community engagement, understanding what the viewers are going to get out of it, is very important. So you don't just run into it, you actually think about it before you actually undertake.
وأنا كتير صراحة فخور إني جاي من بلد بعده محافظ على التاريخ القديم وفي ثقافات كتير وبعدها موجودة لهلا.
I am from an amazing country.
I don't forget anything. Every day remembers my home, every day.
Right now we want people to realize that behind the Syrians we hear about on the news are actually people who are part of a wonderful, rich 5,000-year heritage, and that when you look at their past, even their present, they're part of a very vast, multicultural and diverse set of societies which most people haven't really even heard about. I don't think there's a subject more topical today than Syria. We all know about what's raging as a civil war in Syria and has been for the last 5 years, but one of the things I think we miss out upon is who Syrians actually are.
نعم أنا جيت مع عائلتي أنا وزوجتي وعندي طفلة صغيرة. هي لسه صغيرة فهذا الموضوع شوي صعب عليها بس حاليا عم تعمل أصدقاء عم تحكي شوية كلمات باللغة الإنجليزية. سوريا بلد قديم كتير بحكم إنه هو بلد قديم فأكيد مثل ما نحن شفنا في المعرض هون إنه فيه تعدد ثقافات. فالآن وصلنا لمرحلة إنه كان قبل الحرب سوريا مثال جدا رائع للتعايش بين كل الثقافات وكل الأديان.
Well, the first object I'd like to talk about is actually the first one you see when you come into this exhibition, which is this monumental painting done by Elias Zayat called The Deluge. And so he took the subject of Palmyra. It's a city of so many cultures, so many gods, so many deities that have been part of it.
نحن كنا بنعرفه في سوريا وهلا يعني نحن صحيح بنعرفه بسوريا بس ما نروح نشوف فهلا هون نحن بجيتنا على كندا وهالشيء على المتحفين يعني تعمقنا أكثر وعرفنا أكثر من التاريخ اللي هذا.
Now, one of the most attractive pieces in this exhibition is a piece of carved ivory in the shape of a lion's head. Now, what's very impressive about this piece is the way that the sculptor has been able to infuse this piece of ivory with spirit and life that makes this lion not only ferocious, but also quite lovely at the same time.
Well, I have to say This exhibition talks about the Syrian history. I can't describe everything, but everything just amazing.
Well, one of my favorite objects in this exhibition is actually the earliest piece that we have in the entire chronology. And this is an eye idol. It's over 5,000 years old. And like so many objects of this prehistoric period, we don't really know what it was there for. You just have this wonderful image of eyes staring back at you. This is one of these objects that actually doesn't tell you all that much, but you have to come up with the stories yourself. With this exhibition, Syria, A Living History, what we try to give our public is a chance to understand that Syrians come from a 5,000-year history of culture and heritage. It gives our public, as well as the Syrian refugees themselves, a chance to reflect upon the heritage and culture that they come from.
We have hope, this hope more important for us. We know our country very beautiful and blessed country.
The thing I would say to the world, the heritage and people of Syria, they won't be defeated.
That's a really powerful piece, Henry. And it goes to the heart of this question, Ross, of museums having to push outward and being ideas-driven and being meaningful and emotive. Give us a sense of your perspective now that we've heard Henry's.
Thank you, Cheryl and Henry. So, in a conversation about being meaningful and emotive and brave, I'd like to start by asking you to do something a little bit brave, which is to think about your family for a second. And that could be your work family or your biological family or however you define your family. And I want you to think about, you're not going to share this, but I want you to think about the person in your family who has a mental illness. And I want you to think about the person in your family, might be the same person, who has an addiction. And I want you to think about the person in your family who has some kind of emotional trauma. This is a pervasive set of issues that we face in pretty much all societies, and we deal with this every day. We have this in our families, we have this in our workplaces. In a room like this, if we're a representative demographic of Canadian society, we've got, 100 people struggling with depression, another 100 people struggling with pervasive anxiety. This is a real, present, urgent issue in our society today. And so my work is about trauma, addictions, mental illness, and that whole confluence of themes that go together. And we have this in our lives every day, the vast majority of us, in different ways, and we don't tend to deal with it that well. Like, think about how your family has dealt with the person who's got an addiction, right? That tends not to go very well in your family. So these are issues that people are increasingly recognizing as being important to address and to be truthful about, to be honest about. And my work is about helping organizations to do that. And it gets very tricky because when we're talking about trauma and emotional activation, these are very delicate and unpredictable situations. And people can go from feeling completely normal and contained and healthy and fine to being activated by something they experience or undergo or see just in a heartbeat. So it's very tricky. And my work in museums is about helping museums to navigate the reality that many museums are wanting to enter the space of helping people resolve trauma, helping people grapple with mental illness, helping people resolve addictions. A lot of the work that I do in Vancouver is about the opioid crisis and the fact that in Canada, several thousand people a year are dying from opioid overdose. So these pressing social problems, very real pressing social problems, are starting to come onto the radar of the museum communities. And so museums are thinking, hey, we should do something about this. We should help our communities to heal. And how might we do that? Well, we might grapple with some traumatic material or some activating material in our exhibitions. And that sounds like a great idea, and it does. But when you start to create emotionally activating exhibitions, one of the unintended consequences of that is that you could traumatize people. You can put them in a situation that is surprising and unexpected and activate them emotionally in a well-meaning way and get all kinds of strange consequences as a result of that. Not only for visitors, but also for museum staff who are having to negotiate conversations with traumatized visitors who just came in because they had a free day on the weekend. And suddenly they're upset and crying and angry or whatever it might be. So navigating these traumatic, difficult, real-world scenarios is very challenging. And so as museums enter into that space, there's kind of a gap between what the aim is, what the impulse is toward healing and help and community involvement, and what the reality is, which is that a lot of these conversations are very complex, very difficult to navigate, and fraught with unforeseen challenges and difficulties that you won't know about until you've waded into it far enough that you can't get out. So it's very interesting work. I love the work of trauma. Trauma is awesome. Trauma is how we heal. Trauma is how we find wisdom. There's no wisdom without trauma. That's how it goes. Humans are supposed to be able to learn through joy, but we're idiots and we don't, right? We only learn through pain and suffering, and so trauma is the path for most of us toward healing, which I think is great, but very strange. And so as museums enter that environment more, that landscape of human frailty and human vulnerability, I'm very interested in how we have those conversations so that when we do create museum exhibitions that are highly activating, we do so mindfully, carefully, with some training for staff and some preparedness for visitors so that we don't end up making things worse rather than better.
So that's really compelling, and I think by a show of hands, I'm just trying to get a sense from the audience, how many people in the audience are part of exhibition development or design or programming that you know has been sensitive or potentially sensitive? How many of you have had to work through that kind of experience and maybe wondered about needing or having the right kinds of resources to support that audience coming in? Just by a show of hands. Okay. So there is definitely, I think we're seeing there's going to be more of that kind of work. I mean, as we think about the truth and reconciliation work that we're doing, as we try to work with communities around Me Too, there's a lot of very topical subjects that are going to compel us to think about bravery. So Henry, I'm wondering, how would you assess the state of leadership in museums as it relates to bravery?
That's a very good question. Very loaded, actually. Very loaded there. Look, I think that when it comes to being brave, it's got to come from all levels. And actually, I'll be honest with you, the bravest people are the ones who are not in the senior management levels. They're the ones who are actually creating and thinking the ideas. And I think that if you're looking at leadership, leadership has to be able to become comfortable with this. The rewards are, if you are brave, you can push new ground. You can actually do something that isn't the ho-hum usual thing that you expect for a museum and actually be relevant, which is, I think, the big R word of our day. We have to become relevant. But I'll tell you this, not all museum directors are comfortable with that, because you have to face a board, and the board will say, what were you thinking? And the answer the answer could be many things. I wasn't thinking. That sometimes happens. So didn't understand what was going on. But actually, I think the bravery comes in assessing the situation, being able to communicate that upwards, and really showing the impact that such exhibitions or displays or approaches can actually have. It's rewarding, but you have to be willing to justify, to be intellectually sound about it, and to be circumspect. And if you can do that, then you can do it. But I'm afraid to say if you just want to be brave for the sake of it, you'll probably come a cropper at some point.
Thank you for that. So Ross, the dictionary defines bravery as a verb, enduring or facing unpleasant conditions or behavior without showing fear. So what does museum bravery mean in that context?
Well, I think the first thing it means is that we should change it to courage instead. Because in the world of courage, being afraid is okay. And I think in the museum contexts, navigating these difficult and complicated scenarios is largely about comfort with discomfort. These are very difficult conversations to have. Conversations about war, conversations about historical injustice, conversations about cultural conflicts, simmering long-term cultural conflicts, religious conflicts. These kinds of issues, in the research that I've done with my colleagues, we've done work with, 9/11, for example, or with war in Europe. And what we found there is that the organizations that do well, they tend to be comfortable with this kind of ongoing uncertainty and discomfort, that their vision for the exhibition is not really built from the top down, but rather from the ground up, from the community, in a series of ongoing, difficult, sometimes unresolvable conversations. And so that's brave and also courageous at the same time. But it requires a kind of temperament, or at least a kind of training, for people to be comfortable with what inevitably happens in these situations, which is that we get personally triggered. And that's why I asked you to think about your own family, because you can't enter into this world of working with trauma of other people without your own trauma being triggered. It doesn't work that way. You can't be sort of an objective witness or observer. You get called into the space to be a witness and to be a participant. And so bravery or courage in this environment, in this way of thinking, is largely about being prepared to do some personal work as well as professional work in a way that's perhaps a little different than people are used to.
So then, building on that, Ross, what's the balance between intentionally trying to cultivate experiences and our duty of care for our visitors, staff, and our volunteers? And I'm going to ask you both to answer that question.
I think the ethics of care are very important here. It's very easy to activate people unsafely. It's very easy to traumatize people by just thinking about what's most likely to get them keyed up. You can do that. It's very engaging, but it's also very traumatizing. And sometimes people don't think all the way through to what the consequences might be. Or they think because there might be consequences, let's not do it. It's too activating. And I think there's a middle ground there. Like you said, this balance between recognizing that you might or will activate people, but recognizing that if you are prepared to take on that responsibility of doing that, you also incur the ethical responsibility to take care of people, visitors and staff, so that they can be nudged along in their healing pathway rather than nudged backward.
I couldn't agree more. I think that you have an absolute duty of care. And the starting point is actually being circumspect, understanding what the potential reactions are going to be, and anticipating that. How are you going to do that? Well, I'm afraid to say it's not going to come from sitting in an office saying, well, let's drop a list of risks. You're going to get the risks from your focus groups. And that's crucial because that's where your best eyes and ears on the ground will be. I always tell people, stop using your mouth. Use your ears as the resource you got to use if you're trying to understand the consequences of things that you're about to do.
So Henry, can you tell me who your bravery role models are? Who are those people in the museum world who are just kicking bravery's butt?
Well, I actually have to say, it's not necessarily just in the museum world. I think when you look at artists who are practicing today, the bravery that is actually being exhibited by artists is immense. Not only artists who are confronting big issues today, but are also quite honestly putting their skin where the game is. I mean, I look at one of our lecturers, Wafa Bilal, who was absolutely incredible in terms of his work looking at Iraq and the perceptions of Iraqis in today's society. He even created a very sort of controversial piece of artwork, which was called Shoot an Iraqi, where he set himself up in a room with a remote-controlled paint pellet gun and got shot 70,000 times. Again, it's an incredible experience, a motive that he created. I mean, he was probably more emotionally destroyed by it over that 1 month period than anyone else, but it actually was there for a point. And again, with something that like Wafa does, you got to be careful because it can be too powerful sometimes. And that was an exceptionally powerful piece. So I think that museums, there are artists who are working who I applaud tremendously for their work. But I think the museums that then undertake to exhibit this, that's important because a lot of museums will shy away from any controversy. Almost the bigger the organization, the more prone you will be to pulling back and not doing it. And that's where I applaud the smaller ones that are actually grasping onto this and saying, let's do it. Because the consequences can be dramatic, because in certain organizations, your funding may be cut because it's politically driven. In other organizations, you may find donors who drop you. And that's what museum directors are always facing. How do you balance that? And how do you show relevance versus bravery versus doing something stupid? And I always tell people the difference between bravery and stupidity is about this big. It's not much. And that's where you have to assess. I applaud museums like MoMA. MoMA, when the U.S. 2 years ago put travel restrictions on people from a number of Muslim majority countries, they instantly put out works by artists from those countries. That's exactly what should happen, but that's a political statement. And that's where museums, as directors, you have to understand what you're up to. And I think I applaud Glenn Lowry on what he did for that.
So this is a really challenging time with populism on the rise and this idea that museums are neutral. So in the idea of being brave, can museums still be neutral? What are your thoughts, Henry?
Well, I don't think museums have ever been neutral. I mean, they're there to purport a view. I mean, you can try to be neutral, but actually you're just boring. So, no, I think museums can wade into this. And it's because if you're looking at relevant social issues of today, museums are one of the handful of credible public institutions out there that can tackle some of these questions. They can't tackle all of them, but where there's relevance, I think that there's actually a reason for them to be involved. But again, it's got to be done in a measured, sensible way, and again, not just trying to do it for the sake of doing it.
So Ross, you've done some really exciting work with the Derby museums and the 9/11 museums. So when is bravery not brave?
Well, like I said before, I think it goes over the line when people in their search to become engaging don't think about the consequences, or they do not foresee that this could go sideways in a bunch of different ways. Most of what I've seen in places like Derby and other museums is that the organization has thought mindfully about how to do this. For example, in Derby, they have an interesting outreach project where staff from the museums and volunteers, they take objects from the museum. So these are ancient objects that are supposed to be under glass and hidden away and never touched by anyone except a trained curator, and they take them out into the street. And they get people in the street to touch and hold and feel these objects. And we did a research project with them, and I was particularly struck by one story. We worked with some Syrian refugees there and other people from all over the world, and one of the things they interacted with was a small handmade pottery oil lamp. And at the very bottom of the lamp, there is a thumbprint that you can feel from the person who made it hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago. And so this is a special, sacred, curatorial type of object, and regular people from the general public are touching and feeling this object. And to a person in this particular group that we worked with, they were deeply, deeply affected by the feel and the presence of the thumbprint, of the human print across the centuries, the endurance, and this was a lamp from Syria, right? And so this was an unpredictable result. People in the museum didn't say, hey, there's a thumbprint, let's go out and get people to feel it, right? They said, let's do something heretical in the museum world, and let's take actual real objects out into the street and let people interact with them. And so the bravery there is about being willing to engage with the fundamental, to my mind, purpose of the museum, which is to serve the community and to interact with the community. And as long as that's done, like Henry says, with a sense of engagement with the people who give museums their purpose, then normally it goes pretty well.
So I want to know what questions you have for each other. If you each could maybe share one question that you have Henry to Ross, Ross to Henry, on this question of museums and bravery. What would that question be?
So I'm curious, Henry, to hear if you've had a situation where you wonder later, was that too activating, or did you have you had anything happen where you've had to really scramble to emotionally kind of get something held together, contained? Have you had that happen?
Oh, most certainly so. And I look at performances, I look at some of our exhibitions, and we had an exhibition where we looked at contemporary Syrian art. And there were parts of the display that were so emotionally triggering. People were crying. And you don't expect to cry in a museum display.
But you should.
Exactly.
I mean, really?
Exactly.
Otherwise, what is it for?
Exactly. And this is the interesting thing, because it was the first time in at that point, maybe 3 years or 2.5 years we'd been open, that I actually saw real emotions coming out in the gallery. And what's important is that you can't just let the emotions be emotions and just leave it there. And I think we were very fortunate in that our exhibition design team recognized this. They saw the area where people were going to cry. And just around the corner, they gave a place where people could express themselves. And it was a simple thing as tying a string around one word, and there were, I think, 24 words they could choose from. And they chose the word that expressed what they felt having seen this exhibition, and they tied it up onto the wall. We had to take down the thing and put new ones up because everyone was tying on the words. The number one word was hope. And that's where I think that you can try to trigger emotions, but you also have to have a chance where the user gets to express themselves. And whether it's that or some sort of iPad that doesn't, it's an important two-way street.
Yeah, and I'm really glad to hear that, because one of the things I'm always suggesting to museums is provide a space, some space that people can go and sit down. Maybe put some tea there if you want, but do something like the string thing, or in Derby they had magnetic things, magnetic feeling words, you could move them around. But people need a space of belonging and trust and emotional safety so that they can at least contain themselves if there's no professional psychotherapist wandering the halls to help them. It's not that complicated to do, but it's crucial to do.
And I think the question I'd ask for you is that, in the work that you specialize in, how receptive have you found the museum community?
Thank you for asking the tough question. I've found different levels of receptivity, for sure, depending on the culture, the museum culture of a given place. I've found actually a tremendous amount of diversity. Everything from, we're not interested, this is not relevant to us, to well, we're already doing all that. So I see a tremendous spectrum. One of the interesting things for me is that so far, all of this work that I have done has taken place outside of Canada. And Canadians are a weird bunch. I'm Canadian, so I include myself here, but I think I don't want to sort of stereotype Canada, but when it comes to emotional conversation, when it comes to crying, when it comes to sharing trauma, people get quite anxious and they don't know what to do. And so we don't talk about this stuff a lot in Canada. I was in the Maritimes a couple of years ago, or last year, talking about the opioid crisis in BC and how it's moving like a wave across the country. And when I was there, people were saying, it's not going to come here. We're good. We're fine. No worries. This is a different part of the country. We're not going to talk about that kind of stuff. And of course, very soon after that, it sweeps like a wave across the whole country. So sometimes we are a little bit late in this country at actually facing up to deeply important emotional issues. Once we get to the table, we're good. We're good at containment. Canadians are very good at that. We support each other really well. because it's the North and nature's trying to kill you every day. So you have to be with people, which is great. We have a great group culture. But sometimes in our desire to create a kind of harmony, kind of group harmony, we can lose individual suffering in that. That's been my experience anyway.
So speaking about the way that Canadians face challenging issues, certainly one of the more challenging issues we're all going to be facing, and we should be facing, and doing it with real intention, is telling Indigenous stories, not through our voices, but making space for our Indigenous partners to work with us. Can you talk a little bit about some of the steps that maybe we should be thinking about taking, Henry and Ross, as we begin to build those partnerships in the efforts and the intentions of being brave? Henry, go ahead.
Well, I think that, again, when you're looking at Indigenous cultures and trying to see how museums face that, I think there was a talk here just preceding us which looked at a lot of these issues. There has to be, I think, from my point of view, there has to be two things. One of them is a drive and desire from, whether it's the top or the primary project managers, you got to push that forward. You know, you can't just do it as lip service. You have to take a thesis and push it forward and test it out, and that's where the community engagement comes in. If you don't involve the communities and you just do it top down, you're going to get it wrong in a very bad sort of way. Let's face it, I mean, people's misconceptions of the issues lead to, I'll be frank, headlines such as in North America, or in the U.S. recently with Elizabeth Warren, not understanding the context properly. And you have to be careful of those consequences. So I think that understanding, driving it forward, but then understanding from below that, it's the only approach you can take in this. As a museum ourselves, Islamic art, Indigenous cultures, you may not think that there's much related. Actually, there is. There is. And we look at Indigenous cultures from the perspective of not just a question of within Canada, but Indigenous cultures worldwide. Because, hey, this is not the only set of Indigenous cultures in this country. They're everywhere in the world. And you can actually trace and chart the ebb and flow historically and even in this present day. And it's through that you can start understanding the issues. I think here's a tip. Don't just concentrate on what's happening in this country. Look elsewhere. Because I think the comparisons are going to be very important and perhaps even as important as the actions and the activity that takes place within this country.
So I've done quite a bit of work with Indigenous communities across Canada in my other work, which is with addictions and trauma outside of the museum context. And what I have consistently found there is that because these issues are so complex and so old and so multi-layered, that the question of building trust and building safety and just building to the point where you can have a conversation is itself quite a big step. And I think people sometimes in their urgency to try to resolve things look toward resolution and look toward what their vision of healing is, rather than what seems evident from the work of trauma and addictions, which is that these things take a long time. And the healing pathway is the complex conversation, is staying in the difficult conversation without necessarily a sense of conclusion or a sense of where it's going or a sense of who might lead it, but staying in the difficult conversation. Just like in a family where somebody has a mental illness or an addiction, you don't just fix it. You don't just say, you'll go to treatment for 28 days and then you'll be good to go. It doesn't work that way. You have to kind of peel back to what's underneath it. What's often underneath addiction is a mental health challenge. And then you got to peel that back because that has deep roots. Typically what's underneath a mental health challenge is a trauma. And then you got to peel that back. And you can't do this in a short burst of something. You have to do it in a length of time that lasts years or decades. And so it's the same with these indigenous conversations. So many of us want to fix and resolve and move forward. And I think that's great, but at the same time, we need to recognize that just the first step of building trust and safety is itself a colossal step. And we're doing it, but I think we should be patient with everyone about this.
So this is really helpful, and I just think I have one question that I have left for this panel. So we are action-oriented people in the museum sector. So I want to make sure that both of you leave this audience with some tips, some steps, some what must you do's as you're going back to your spaces and you're planning your programs, your lectures, your exhibitions. What are those action steps?
I think the biggest hindrance to courage and bravery is actually yourselves. And, it's not often you get a speaker who says you're the problem, but you are. And part of the reason why is that I think we hold ourselves back. Practice, tradition, things that have happened in the past. We want to follow what others have done as opposed to innovate, create, jump a few generations, jump a few steps ahead. And so my advice, and if there's a toolbox that I'd actually offer you guys, it's, be willing to break away from business as usual, things that you're used to, things that are prescribed or pure policy. I think that what is important is that you have to look at what's, when you're searching for issues and topics that are important, look for relevance. Look for things that are relevant as issues today, that are relevant to you as an institution, that actually hit what you are as what your mission actually is. And if you find something that actually makes sense, the biggest thing is for you to go beyond what is quote-unquote normal and grasp it, run with it, make sure you talk to the right people, whether from the bottom up or the top down. And let me tell you, the rewards are there if you can do it in a measured and thoughtful manner.
So I have two basic suggestions, both of which are complicated. First of all, ask yourself whether the leadership at your museum, those people have empathy. If they're good with empathy. The ability to sit with a person who is in pain and suffering and to listen and to give appropriate feedback. A lot of this does come from leadership. If leadership is able to do this, if your leaders have empathy, then you can have an organization that has empathy. And an organization that has empathy is one in which there's a sense of belonging and emotional trust and safety for people. And if you have that, which itself is a big challenge, then you can train your people to be empathic and helpful to visitors to the museum. Because nothing can happen with visitors if the staff and the organization in turn are not in a place where they can support one another. You can't have a situation where one or two people on the floor with visitors are very empathic and the organization is not. It doesn't work. Those people, in my experience, burn out and leave. So the whole organization has to be a chain of empathic connection all the way from the very top down to the floor so that people at every stage there can feel supported and connected. Because when you have activating exhibitions, people on the floor, not just visitors but staff members, are going to be activated all the time by stuff they hear and participate in, and they're going to turn to their colleagues for empathy and support. And that group of colleagues needs to be supported by people who understand that that's crucial, that the mental health and wellness of staff are crucial aspects. So they determine more or less whether any of this works at all. So that's my first suggestion about the organization. The second suggestion is about training your people. You can train people to contain trauma. It's a skill like any other that can be learned by most people. The prerequisite skill, the bottom line prerequisite skill for learning to deal with trauma is empathy. So you can train people in that too. But once you have an organization that supports itself emotionally, supports people emotionally, then you can have an exhibition that is able to support people. And then you can be as courageous as you want, and to create space for people to be emotional. Like Henry was talking about in his example, right? Create space so that people can take a break and go and sit down and collect themselves. Ideally, if you could have counselor-trained staff on the floor around highly activating exhibitions, that would be the gold standard for sure. Hardly anybody's doing this. The only example of this that I've seen, we did a project with the War Childhood Museum in Sarajevo last year. Super activating content, war, right? Trauma everywhere. And they built their museum from the ground up with psychotherapy people involved from the very beginning. So my other suggestion is get those people involved. They know what they're doing. Well, some of them know what they're doing.
So I have been extremely honored to be in the middle of this conversation and to be able to ask you two gentlemen to respond and to have you respond so candidly. And clearly we've been, in a conversation about collaborating for impact, and certainly to your point, Ross, there are partners out there in the community who have these skills, who will partner with us willingly when we, open up the dialogue and have the conversation. But I'm so encouraged by this museum's sector and the professionalism and the enthusiasm and the bravery. And know that, as Carolyn King said yesterday morning, we can just go out there and do it. So we need to just do it. Thank you. So we didn't actually have time for questions, and I just wanted to check in to make sure whether anybody had a burning question. If that's okay, if we could just check really quick. Is that all right? She can't say anything. Okay, so she's in the back. Perfect. So this is my Oprah moment. Give me a second. I'm gonna run this microphone over to Jeanette, who has a question.
My name's Jeanette Kwayakshith. I'm the Indigenous Outreach and Learning Coordinator at the ROM. I didn't get to see you around the podium, but saw your video. I'm just keen to, when talking about Indigenous historical trauma and that's going to be the lens that I look through. I'm just curious to, what examples do you folks have of activating some of the cultural approaches to wellness, or activating the community's tools, the community's relevant cultural tools, maybe that's welcoming folks with a ceremony. What efforts have you made? Because I know that I had suggested an Indigenous residential school film once, and we were told, we can't support the emotion that'll stir up. And I thought, well, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, the Indigenous community would plan for that, and the idea got shut down. And I'm new to the museum sector, so I can have these big ideas. It doesn't necessarily mean I know who to talk to, or over time I learned to sequence that conversation and know who to talk to first. But in the future, right, when it comes to looking at Indigenous historical trauma, not just trauma or intergenerational trauma, because it comes from somewhere. But how do we engage, or if you've got examples of engaging with community to drive that bus? How does the community inform museums on how we take care of their needs?
Henry or Ross?
I have two quick examples of one where it goes well and one where it goes south. Typically, in most of the work that I do in Indigenous communities these days, that work is, opened by an elder, witnessed by the community. Indigenous rituals are used in the process throughout whatever we're doing, and in that sense, the conversation is led by the community itself, right? And those things go really well. Where it doesn't go well, I worked with a group a while ago where they were actors in theater production that was about the residential school system, and they traveled across the country performing. And one of the things that happened was that several of the actors found that they just kept re-traumatizing themselves over and over and over again. This is not the audience, but the actors, right? And so it's of course possible to step into that place of trauma and do something that is helpful, but also lose oneself in the trauma. So again, it's a very complex conversation, and there's no single answer about to my mind, about what to do or what not to do. It's really about being present to the emotional state and the emotional reality of the community and of people in the community on an ongoing basis, which is why I think empathy is so important, because that's the resonance that allows us to stay in touch with people.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. You're not going to have the solutions in your head. It's going to have to come through consultation, what exactly works or not. I myself have been involved in Pakistan, for example, where you have indigenous communities who have been Hazara communities. I'll name them, who have been, who have been displaced and who are minorities and who are definitely marginalized. And when you look at the artwork that they create, it's written large in what they do. Now the question is, okay, that's one form of expression. It's a safe form, I suppose, but the question is, how is that reacted to by other parts of the society, not just Hazaras, but by perhaps the ruling class? I'll be honest with you, we don't know the answer yet because it's still such early days. We test it out, we see, and again, you can only do it through a little bit of trial and error, and at least through the form of the visual arts. There's a way to get it across without making it so blatant and obvious that you start triggering your emotions by the non-Indigenous sides. If it were more of a piece of literature, it could be more polemic. And so I think different media can also help mediate what the reactions and how polemic it can be.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. I think this has been one of the most meaningful sessions I've ever had at an OMA conference, so I thank all three of you for coming in today. Honestly, I've been thinking of so many things. At Grey Roots, which is in Owen Sound, we talk about difficult histories, but it's mostly in the context of Black history because Owen Sound was the northernmost terminus of the Underground Railway. So we ordered a book. I don't know if anyone else has ordered the Julia Rice book? Rose book, sorry, and it's mostly in the context of interpreting Black history in U.S. historic sites. And she psychoanalyzes, that's probably the wrong word, but profiles 5 different types of visitors and what stage they are in trauma and healing, but she doesn't talk about staff and volunteers, so I think that's really interesting. And I don't know if any of you follow Honey on Facebook, Humans of New York. Oh my gosh, you got to be following it. Except for the last few weeks, this guy has been in Rwanda. And he's interviewing people about the genocide that's happening there between the folks that are there. And it's just triggering so much in the people who are reading all of this information. It made me also think perhaps before people go through an exhibit, there should be like a rating, like you do in a movie. This is restricted. This will have violence.
I think that's a great idea.
Just something to prepare people. So if you feel like you're not ready, I've suffered a lot of trauma in my life, and I know what my triggers would be. And you're right. You were talking about the actors just re-traumatizing themselves and re-traumatizing themselves. I really resonated with what Henry said about museums are not about things anymore. We need to have an idea. We need to put our feelings in there, emotions, making sure that it's meaningful, but also being not just brave and relevant, but being circumspect, making sure we look at what we're presenting there. I also thought about Andrea Walsh, who is a UVic prof in Victoria, and they had an exhibit that was made from art that was made by kids, I think in the 50s when they were at residential school. So just using the art of the kids and then getting the survivors of that who would come and talk about their pieces of art, or the family that was coming in to talk about the pieces of art. I thought it seems like a little piece of cheese, but that little piece of cheese really led to a more fulsome story, and maybe not everything all at once. So yes, building trust, building safety, it does take time. And I think in the museum business, we feel like maybe we don't have that much time and we're in a hurry and we want to change the world. But things like this really do take time. And if you're doing an exhibit about Indigenous folks, or you're doing it about Black history, please, please, please work with those communities in your community so that this voice coming through that exhibit is their voice. You're just helping them tell the story. So I want to say thanks again, Ross and Cheryl, who's changing the world, and Henry, you probably all are, but Cheryl, I thank you so much, everyone.